Hey guys, tonight I want to tell you about one of the most frightening nights Laura Ingalls ever wrote down. December 1883, 16 years old, teaching her first school, boarding with strangers in a claim shanty 12 miles from home. One night she wakes to screaming and sees the woman of the house holding a butcher knife over her own husband. Nobody out there was a monster, and that's where tonight's story begins. One small piece of business before we turn the lamp low. If these long nights of history help you sleep, a like and a subscribe truly help me keep making them. Though only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there. And if you'd ever like to bring a little piece of this world home, our 3 little books live at prairiesecrets.com. Just scan the QR code on your screen, or, if you're listening on your phone, you'll find the links waiting in the description and the pinned comments below. No hurry at all, whenever you want this world to hold. Now, settle whatever needs settling. Let the lamp go low, let your shoulders come down, and let tonight move slowly on purpose. We'll start in that shanty with Laura, and then we'll walk out the door and across the whole lonely prairie, through the winters and the waiting, and the women the record barely kept. If sleep takes you somewhere in the middle, let it. That's what this is for. I'll keep watch. Picture a claim shanty in December 1883. One room, board walls, a curtain strung across the middle on a wire. The lamp is out. The wind is not. We're in Dakota territory, 12 miles south of a raw little railroad town called Smet. The town is 3 years old. The prairie around it is as old as weather, and it has not yet agreed to any of this. Not the shanties, not the section lines, not the confident little schoolhouse districts drawn on paper in offices far away. The shanty belongs to a settler named Bouchie. It is small the way a packing crate is small, board and tar paper, and in winter it holds 4 people. Louis, his wife Olive, their little boy, and for one term of school, a boarder. The boarder is a girl of 16 with brown braids and a level gaze, and she does not want to be there any more than the walls want to hold the heat. Her name is Laura Ingalls. You know her. The whole world knows her, or thinks it does, and tonight is partly about the difference. Her teaching certificate was only days old when she first stood in front of a classroom. On the 10th of December, 1883, the county superintendent had examined her privately and written her out a 3rd grade certificate. 3rd grade did not mean she would teach 3rd graders. It meant the lowest passing mark on the examination, good for 1 term, in a territory so hungry for teachers that it graded them like eggs and shipped them anyway. The scarcity behind that leniency was real. Dakota was organising school districts faster than it could grow anyone to stand in them, and a superintendent who waited for perfect candidates would have waited while the district stood empty. So he bent the calendar, took a bright town girl at her book's word, and solved December's problem in an afternoon. It was practical and kindly meant. And it is how a 16-year-old came to be handed a school, a stove, and a boarding place among strangers, all in the same week. There was one more wrinkle, and it sat in the law itself. The territory's brand new school code said candidates for the teacher's examination should be over the age of 18. Laura was 16. The superintendent examined her at a private sitting, wrote the certificate and dated it, and nobody out on that thin edge of settlement asked a single question. The prairie needed teachers more than it needed the letter of its own rules. She took the certificate because her family needed the money. We'll come back to why, because the why matters more than almost anything else in this story. For now, know only this much. The school was called the Bouchie School. 5 pupils in an abandoned claim shanty with a stovepipe through the roof. Some of the pupils nearly her own age. The pay was $20 a month, board included. Board included. 2 words that decided everything. They meant she would live with the Bouchies, sleep behind that curtain, eat at that silent table for 2 months of a Dakota winter 12 miles from her mother. In her memoir, and later in the novel she built from it, Laura remembered the cold of that little house as the honest kind. The kind you could fight with a stove and a quilt. What she could not fight was the quiet. Mrs. Bouchie barely spoke, to her or to anyone. Meals happened in a silence you could set a plate on. The little boy whined and was not corrected. The stove smoked. And at night, Laura lay on her narrow bed behind the curtain and listened to the wind take the corners of the shanty one at a time. Some nights there was another sound under the wind, a low voice on the other side of the curtain, going on and on in the dark. It said in the versions Laura wrote down that she hated this country, hated the claim, hated the shanty, hated all of it, and would not stay. If you have ever lain very still in a strange house, pretending to be asleep because the air itself felt like an argument, you know the exact size of those nights. Laura was a boarder and a child in the one room there was. There was nowhere to go and nothing to do but breathe slow and wait for morning. Then came the night she wrote down 3 separate times over the rest of her life. It began as screaming. Laura woke in the black cold with her heart going, and the room past the curtain was full of a voice she knew and did not know. Mrs. Bouchie out of bed, screaming at her husband. Laura moved the edge of the curtain, because not looking was worse. What she saw stayed seen for 70 years. Olive Bouchie stood over the bed where her husband lay. In her hand, catching what thin light a winter room has, was a butcher knife. Hold the picture without flinching at it, because the details matter, and 2 of them matter most. The knife was not over Laura. It was never over Laura, not for 1 second of that night. It hung over Louis Bouchie, and what his wife wanted in Laura's telling was not blood so much as a door. She wanted to go back east. She said so, while the knife said the rest. Louis talked. That is all the record gives him. A man flat on his back in the dark, talking his wife down out of the worst mint of her life, in a voice Laura remembered as low and steady. No one was cut. The knife went back to the kitchen. The shanty went quiet again, or something shaped like quiet. And the girl behind the curtain lay awake until grey light, her back against the cold boards, listening to a house pretend to sleep. In the morning, nobody said one word about it. Breakfast happened. The walk to the school shanty happened. That may be the strangest true thing in this whole story, that the day after a butcher knife, there was arithmetic. Laura finished the term. She counted the weeks the way you'd count fence posts in fog, and she never once told the Bouchies what she had seen, and they never once asked. On Fridays, more often than she had any right to expect, a young homesteader named Ingalls Wilder came jingling out from town behind a good team, in cold that cracked wood, to carry her the 12 miles home for Sunday. In her telling, she did not love him yet. She loved the sleigh. Anyone would have. Those Friday rescues deserve one honest note, because Laura gave it herself years later with a candour that still makes readers smile. Ingalls Wilder was 10 years older, quiet and steady, and she hardly knew what to make of him. What she knew was that his cutter was small and fast, that his horses were the finest match team in the county, and that when the runners sang over the snow at 40 below, every mile of it was a mile away from the Bouchies. She rode with him, she admitted, for the going home. He drove those 12 miles twice every weekend anyway, all winter, said almost nothing, and waited. The patience of that young man is its own small chapter of prairie endurance. It ends, a few years on, in a wedding. Here is the thing to keep beside you tonight, like a warm stone in a cold bed. Nearly 50 years later, when Laura Ingalls Wilder had become the most beloved chronicler of the American frontier, a woman famous, above all for leaving the darkness out she put this night in. She wrote it into her memoir. She wrote it into the last novel published in her lifetime, and when her editor suggested the scene was too frightening for children and ought to go, she said no. She gave the chapter its name herself. A Knife in the Dark. A writer who softened everything kept this. Tuck that question under your pillow, why this night, of all the nights she buried, because tonight is the long answer. And the answer starts with the woman who held the knife. Her name barely survives. Olive Bouchie. In the novel, Laura would rename her Mrs. Brewster. and for over 80 years readers have met her only for one chapter, the way you would meet a storm. A hard, silent woman in a little house, then a scream, then a knife. A villain shaped like a wife. The records tell a thinner and sadder story. The Bouchies were a knot of related households holding claims together on the open land south of Smet. Brothers and half-brothers and in-laws, a settlement with more relatives in it than neighbours. Louis had taken his claim like the others, proving up toward a patent, and the shanty he brought his wife to was the standard model. 1 room, boards and tar paper, a stove, a bed, a table, a curtain. The schoolhouse itself tells you the economics of the place. It was not built as a school at all. It was an abandoned claim shanty with benches knocked together and a stove installed, and the district's whole library was whatever the 5 pupils carried in with them. Laura walked to it across open snow each morning with the older pupils, taught spelling and sums with her back to the stove, and walked back at 4 into a house where nothing waited but supper and silence. School, for the teacher, was the easy part of the day. Researchers with the South Dakota Historical Society went looking for these people generations later when Laura's original memoir finally came to print. They found the family in the censuses and the county files. They found the school records that put a 16-year-old named Ingalls in front of 5 Bouchie settlement children. They found, in a courthouse vault, a file of family trouble we will open at the end of tonight, gently. What no file holds is Olive herself. No diary, no letter, no photograph anyone can point to with certainty. The one scene of her life that anyone on earth remembers was written by the teenage boarder behind the curtain, decades later, from memory. So we will not diagnose her. Nobody alive has that right. No doctor of her own time ever wrote a word about her that survives, and a butcher knife at midnight is not a medical chart. What we can do is stand in her doorway a moment and take an honest inventory of her circumstances, because those are documented and they are heavy. She was living in 1 room, in winter, on a claim in a settlement of her husband's people, none of them her own. She had a small child and no woman friend the record can find. The nearest town was 12 miles off by wagon track, which in a Dakota December might as well have been 50. Her nearest female company that winter was a schoolgirl who was paid to be there, kept her eyes down, and left every Friday she could. Daylight lasted about 9 hours. The rest was lamp and wind, and the voice of a marriage in a room with no doors inside it. And the plan, the official plan, the one the whole family was working, was for this to go on. Another year and another, until the claim proved up or broke them. In Laura's account, Olive wanted one thing, and finally said it with a knife in her hand because no one had listened when she said it softer. She wanted to go home, east, back to kitchens with women in them, roads with wagons on them, a horizon with something on it. What she felt beyond that no record says. You would have to have been the curtain to know more, and even the curtain only heard the winter's worth of nights that Laura heard. Instead of guessing, hold on to one plain fact. When Laura finally wrote the scene, she did not write a monster either. She wrote a woman at the end of something. She never explained her, never sentenced her, never gave her a next chapter. Tonight we can do a little better. Because Olive Bouchie was not a strange, private failure of one woman's nerves. She was standing at the exact spot where a whole continent's experiment pressed down hardest, on wives, in winter, at the far end of a wagon tracks. To see the machine that was pressing on her, you have to step out her door. So step out the door with me a minute, stand where her wash line would be, pull the shawl tight, and turn all the way around slowly and count what you see. Grass, sky, the shanty behind you. Perhaps, a long way off, one other low roof, no taller on the horizon than a knuckle on a table. In most directions, at most hours, that is the entire inventory of the visible world. No tree, no hill worth the name, no church spire, no chimney smoke but your own, no fence even, in the early years. The land is not empty the way a room is empty. It is empty the way the sea is empty, in every direction all the time. None of that was an accident. It was policy, written in Washington and stamped in land offices, and it is the quiet villain of tonight's whole story. The Homestead Act offered a family 160 acres, a quarter of a square mile on one great condition. They had to live on it, not near it, not in a village within reach of it, on it, in a dwelling for 5 years, or the land went back. Think about what that rule did to the map. It took the oldest human arrangement there is, the cluster, the village, the lane, the well everybody shares, and unfolded it flat. One house per quarter section, screwed down in the middle of its own grass like a button on a cushion. Even in a township where every single claim was taken, the nearest neighbour's door stood half a mile off, and often a full mile. In new country, with half the claims still empty and some abandoned, 3 miles of grass between kitchens was nothing unusual. A journalist named Eugene Smalley spent years riding through this country while it filled, and he put his finger on exactly this point. American farmers, he wrote, had scattered themselves across the land in a way almost no farming people in the history of the world ever had. The peasant of Europe, whatever else his miseries, walked home at night to a village street, to bells, gossip, lamplight in other windows, a wedding, a funeral, a face. The American settler walked home to his own quarter section, out of sight of every other human dwelling, and called it independence. Smalley did not think it was independence. He thought it was an experiment in isolation conducted on a scale no one had ever dared, with farm families as the subjects. He even pleaded, in print, for the obvious remedy: let the farmers regroup, pull the houses together into little hamlets at the section corners, share a well and a schoolhouse and an evening. Nobody did it. The land laws paid people to stay apart, and so apart they stayed. There was one more twist in the land laws, and the settlers learned it slowly. Railroad sections and school sections checkerboarded the map, and speculators held whole townships empty, waiting on prices. So the real distances often ran double what the survey promised. A family might prove up faithfully for 5 years with 3 occupied houses in walking distance and 40 empty quarters between them and church. The loneliness was not even efficient. It was loneliness with vacancies. Now put weather and distance on top of the geometry. 12 miles behind a team of horses over unbroken prairie was around 2 hours each way in good weather. In snow it was a gamble with your fingers and your toes on the table, and every settler knew someone who'd lost that bet. Town, church, post office, doctor, store, another woman's kitchen, all of it lived on the far side of that arithmetic. A man might make the trip once a week for coal and flour and the mail, and count it a chore. His wife, with bread rising and children underfoot and no second driver in the family, often simply did not go. Not that week, not that month. There were women on the plains, and their letters and memoirs say so plainly, who did not leave their own claim from first snow to thaw. And so the land began to do something to time itself. Monday looked like Tuesday. The horizon did not change, because there was nothing on it to change. The grass moved the way water moves, in long silver swells running to the edge of the sky, which is beautiful for an afternoon and something else entirely by February. The people who lived it kept reaching for ocean words, without ever planning to. They wrote of the prairie rolling like the sea. They called their wagons prairie schooners. They spoke of claims as islands, of being becalmed, of drowning in grass. An ocean then, with one difference that made all the difference. Nobody expects a family to anchor alone in the middle of the Atlantic and raise children there on the deck. Distance out there even changed what a visit looked like. On land that flat, a woman could see a wagon coming for the better part of an hour before it arrived. A black speck growing on the shimmer, watched from the doorway with a hand shading her eyes. The kettle already moved to the front of the stove on speculation, and at night the settlers kept the old custom of the lamp in the window, not as decoration but as navigation, one small human star for anyone crossing the dark. People who grew up on claims wrote of both things with the same ache. The hour-long approach of company, the little light that said somebody is here. Laura herself loved this country, loved it her whole life, the light, the wideness, the wild geese going over in long ropes, spring coming across the grass like a green fire. That is real, and tonight is not here to argue with her. But she had seen both sides of the ledger by the time she was grown, and she knew people the wideness fed and people it starved, because the empty distance was only the stage. What performed on it day and night without intermission was the thing settlers wrote about more than the loneliness itself, the sound, or rather the two sounds taking turns. The first was the wind. On the open plains there was nothing to slow it, no forest, no ridge, no city wall, so it arrived with its shoulder down and it stayed. It was not a gust, not an event. It was a condition, like the temperature, and it could hold for days. It thrummed the stovepipe wires until they sang. It worked the tar paper at the corners of the shanty, a loose flap going all night like a knuckle on a door when nobody ever was knocking. It threw grit and seed against the one window. It leaned on the boards and made them talk. In a sod house it was quieter, and settlers said the quiet of a soddy had its own price, because then you heard nothing at all. When the railroads and the telegraph finally stitched across the grass, the wind found the wires, and the settlers got a brand new voice in the orchestra, a thin, endless humming along the section lines, rising and falling for days. Some found it companionable, proof the world was connected to somewhere. Others said it was the loneliest sound the prairie ever learned to make. Settlers' memoirs come back to the wind again and again, the way a tongue keeps finding a sawtooth. Not the cold, which they expected, not the work, which they'd been promised, the noise, the never stopping, nothing personal, nowhere to hide noise. A Texas writer of that generation, Dorothy Scarborough, built an entire novel around a young wife undone by it, and called the book, simply, The Wind. When it was made into a moving picture in the last years of the silent screen, audiences watched a woman alone in a shack with the sand hissing at the walls, and the plains people who saw it did not find the idea far-fetched. Some found it hard to sit through. The second sound was worse, and it was the silence. On still days, with the grass quiet, the plains could produce an absence of sound that people raised among woods and wagons and church bells had never met in their lives. No bird, because there was no tree, no water, no cart, no voice. Quiet so complete you could hear your own blood at work, and the little ringing your ears make when they are given nothing at all to do. One modern researcher, writing in a journal of historical archaeology, went at this with instruments and audiograms and proposed something gently unsettling. Between the ceaseless wind and the bottomless quiet, some settler's hearing may have tuned itself wrong, the way an ear strains in an empty house, until ordinary sounds landed like alarms, and no sound at all felt like being watched. Sleeplessness, dread, tears with no cause anyone could name. It is one hypothesis, offered carefully, and tonight we hold it carefully. But it agrees with what the settlers themselves kept saying. They said the country was too quiet to sleep in and too loud to think in, and they meant both at once, and they were not being poetic. A woman in a shanty heard the wind take up at dusk and knew it would still be there at breakfast, the same 3 notes. A woman in a soddy on a windless night heard her own heart and the lamp flame and nothing else on the surface of the earth. Neither one of them had anyone to mention it to. That was the design. That was the quarter-section map, working exactly as written. By the 1880s, the people out there had begun to notice what all of this was doing to some of their neighbours, and they began, in their own vocabulary, to say so out loud. They did not say prairie madness. Hold on to that, because it matters to everything that follows. That tidy, shivery little phrase mostly belongs to later generations, to writers looking back. The words they used at the time were heavier and plainer, and you find them in 2 kinds of places. You find them first in the newspapers, County weeklies across the plains carried them in the same small type as hog prices and railroad timetables. A farmer's wife, taken to the hospital for the insane. A homesteader found wandering. A settler, adjudged insane by the probate court, his neighbours escorting him east on the cars. The items ran 2 sentences, 3 at most. The frontier press did not linger, and the neighbours' reading did not need it to. Everyone knew a claim where the curtain stayed shut, and you find the words in the doctor's vocabulary of the day, which was its own kind of weather report. Melancholia, for the sadness that would not lift. Mania, for the frenzy that would not rest. Nervous prostration, for the person worn simply to collapse. Hysteria, a word aimed at women so reliably it may as well have been spelled with her name. None of these were prairie diseases. They were the century's whole map of the troubled mind, and the plain simply filled the map with fresh addresses. The newspapers had their own gentler dialect for the worst of it. A settler had been in failing health. A wife was visiting relatives east, indefinitely. A farmer had sold out suddenly and returned to Illinois. Every county page carried a small weather system of such sentences, and the neighbours could read the pressure falling under everyone. Then, in September of 1893, the Quiet got named in public, in the politest magazine in America. Eugene Smalley, the same journalist who had measured the loneliness of the quarter-section map, published an essay in the Atlantic Monthly called The Isolation of Life on Prairie Farms, and in it he set down a sentence that has not stopped echoing since. An alarming amount of insanity occurs in the new prairie states, among farmers and their wives. Read that again, slowly, the way it would have been read by lamplight in 1,000 of the very farmhouses it described. Not miners, at the end of the world's loneliest diggings. Not soldiers. Farmers and their wives. The most ordinary people the Republic had. The people every 4th of July speech called its backbone. Smalley was not a doctor, and did not pretend to be. He was a witness with a notebook, and his explanation was a list of absences. No village, no church within reach, no school worth the walk, no evening street, no market day, no faces but each other's, week upon week upon week. The trouble with the prairie, he argued, was not any single hardship. Hardship people can spend. It was the subtraction of everything human beings had ever wrapped around hardship to make it bearable. Now, tonight owes you honesty about what that famous sentence was and what it was not. It was testimony from a careful, travelled, sober witness in the most respectable print in the country. It was not a count. Smalley had no statistics worth the name. He offered alarm, not arithmetic, and we should take it exactly as offered. What survives around his sentence is a pattern, not a proof. The 2-line newspaper items. The asylums the new states were building and enlarging as fast as they could raise the brick. The long shelf of diaries and memoirs, women's above all, in which the empty distance is described as a weight on the mind, in 100 different hands, over 40 years, with nobody coordinating the testimony. Later tonight we will open the asylum ledgers themselves and see how far they can carry us, and where they quietly stop. There is a surprise waiting in that room, but a pattern in testimony is still a pattern. And the Ingalls family, whose daughter we left lying awake behind a curtain in the Bouchie shanty, had spent the previous 15 years living out every single item on Smalley's list of subtractions, one wagon trip at a time. If you want to know what the weight felt like from inside a family, you follow them. Because the prairie rarely broke anyone with one blow, it preferred installments. And the first installment, for the Ingalls as for thousands of families, was simply this. They could never, ever stop moving. The Ingalls family story, told honestly from the records, is a story about moving. Set the storybook covers aside for a moment and look at the itinerary the way a county clerk would. Wisconsin first, the big woods near Pepin, where Laura was born in 1867, in a cabin within walking distance of grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins. Then Kansas, 800 miles by wagon, to a cabin Charles raised on land that was not his to claim, on the edge of Indian country. 2 years, no title, and back they came to the very same Wisconsin woods they had left. Coming back is its own kind of defeat, and the family had now crossed half the country to stand where they started, then west again, to Minnesota, to the banks of Plum Creek near Walnut Grove. First a dugout scooped into the creek bank, a house with a dirt roof and one papered window, and then a fine sawn lumber house built on credit against a wheat crop. Hold that phrase. Built on credit against a crop. Then, after the years we're about to walk through, a year in Burr Oak, Iowa that the books never mention, the family running someone else's hotel, next door to a saloon, Laura old enough to remember all of it and ordered in effect to forget it. Then back to Walnut Grove, renting working storekeepers' jobs, and then at last in 1879, Dakota Territory, the railroad camp, the claim, to Smet, where the story began tonight, and where the moving finally stopped because there was nowhere further to fall. Laura, decades on, could still recite the inventory of that childhood in dwellings. A log house, a dugout, a sod-roofed cabin, a hotel, rented rooms behind a store, a railroad shanty, a claim shanty, a house in town, all before she was grown. 8 kinds of roof, 1 childhood. When readers marvel that her books read like a tour of every way Americans ever housed themselves on a frontier, the answer is simple. She was not researching. Count it up and you get 7 or 8 uprootings in roughly 12 years, and the reason was never wanderlust, whatever the song said. It was arithmetic with teeth. Every move was a debt outrunning a harvest, or a harvest that never came, or a promise about the next place that the last place had already broken. The paper trail Caroline Fraser followed for her biography of the family shows it plainly. Notes signed, mortgages taken, taxes owed, one storekeeper's ledger after another carrying the family at interest. Charles Ingalls was no villain, and tonight will not make him one. He was warm, capable, endlessly hopeful, adored by his daughters, and by the records one of the hardest working men in any county he touched. Carpenter, clerk, bookkeeper, butcher's help, justice of the peace, railroad timekeeper, anything. But the same records show the pattern his daughters' novels forgave with all their might. The debts rode along in the wagon every single time. The fresh start never started fresh. And here is where tonight asks you to shift your weight to the other side of the wagon seat, because this room is not finally about Charles. A move west for the man holding the reins was at least a decision. He had read the pamphlet. He had talked to the land agent, walked the ground, chosen. Hope is easier to carry when it was your idea. For the woman on the seat beside him, the move was usually something that happened to her, with 1 week's notice, in the middle of a baking. Carolyn Ingalls left a settled Wisconsin neighborhood with family on every side, left it twice in fact, and after that left every friendship, every church pew, every trusted midwife and borrowing neighbor and burying ground over and over for the rest of her working life. Each new place meant starting the web again from one thread. Each departure meant cutting it. Her opinion of all this survives in exactly one recorded form, and it is not a complaint. It is the family's memory of a promise she extracted somewhere along the road, that wherever they landed, whatever it cost, the girls would go to school. That was the flag she planted. Everything else she folded away, neatly where nobody would find it. Consider, too, what each departure actually looked like from the doorway. The wagon held what the wagon held. Furniture went cheap to neighbours or stayed behind, the cow was sold or led, and a woman's whole material past had to fit in a trunk, the wedding china wrapped in quilts if it was lucky, the daguerreotypes, the good dress. Then came days or weeks of road, and at the end of it, no house. The first task in every new country was shelter before winter, which meant a dugout, a shanty, a floorless cabin, and the trunk not fully unpacked for a year. Some women, the diaries say, quietly stopped unpacking at all after the second or third move. There is no plainer way to say what repetition teaches. Modern readers, grown women curled up with these books they loved at 8 years old, keep bumping into the same splinter, and one of them said it perfectly in a comment under a video much like this one. The husband packs the wagon, and the family follows, powerless. What read as adventure in childhood reads, at 40, as a low hum of dread. That hum is this room. Historians of settlement will tell you plainly that women's diaries of the Westward Road are full of it. The grief of the packing up worked out in lists and silences, because the moving itself was the injury, not the distance covered, the routes cut, a woman's whole defence against the loneliness this night has been describing. Her mother, her sisters, her church, her known faces, was amputated with every fresh start, and asked to regrow from nothing, in thinner soil, one claim further out. Do that to a person 7 times in 12 years, and you do not need any madness in the family. You only need arithmetic. By 1874, the family had rooted again on Plum Creek, and for one whole season the arithmetic finally looked ready to come out right. Which brings us to the wheat, and to the summer the sky turned into a lid. The wheat that year was the best Charles had ever put in the ground, and that is not storybook talk. Western Minnesota in the early 1870s was being advertised across 2 continents as the coming wheat country of the world, and for once the advertising and the soil agreed. The Ingalls family had borrowed against exactly that future. The sawn lumber house, the Borton doors and real glass windows, all of it resting on the crop standing green and heavy down by the creek. Weeks from cutting, it stood thick enough to swim a hand through. Pay off everything, the crop said, wheat left over. Then, on a hot afternoon, the light changed. People who were children that summer described it for the rest of their lives, and they all reached for the same helpless comparisons. A cloud that glittered, snow falling shining out of a clear sky. The cloud had a sound, a deep working hum, and it did not pass over. It came down. It was locusts, the Rocky Mountain locust, moving in swarms that stop meaning anything when you say them plainly, so people said them sideways. Swarms that grey the sun for hours. Swarms the weather stations and railroad men measured in miles of front, hundreds of miles of it, riding the high wind. The following summer, a doctor in Nebraska with a telescope and a telegraph timed one single swarm passing overhead for days, and reckoned it at nearly 2,000 miles long. Cut that estimate in half, and then in half again, and it is still a number with no kitchen use. What the numbers meant on Plum Creek was simpler, and Laura watched it happen at 7 years old. The wheat went first, the whole borrowed against house-buying crop of it, eaten standing. Then the garden to the ground, then the grass, then the leaves, then the bark off young trees, then the wool off live sheep, and the handles of tools left out overnight, gnawed for the salt of a man's sweat. The hens gorged on locusts until the eggs were not fit to eat. The creek ran brown with them. The sound of it was the detail nobody forgot. People reached for the same comparison independently, 100 miles apart. It sounded like fire. A dry working crackle, the sound of a prairie burning without smoke, coming from every direction at once, which was the sound of uncountable small jaws. Families ran into the fields with sacks and smoke pots and beat at the cloud like people fighting weather. On the railroads, crushed locusts greased the rails so thick that engine wheels spun and trains stood helpless on the grades. Men swore to that detail in print because nobody back east would believe it. And when the living cloud finally rose and moved on, it left its real cruelty behind in the ground. The creatures had drilled the banks and fields full of egg cases, packed in by the million to the acre. Every settler ploughing that fall turned them up in ribbons and understood, with the particular quiet that comes over a person reading a debt they cannot pay, that next summer's plague was already planted like a crop nobody ordered, and so it proved. 1875 hatched black with them. Whole counties gave up wheat entirely. Relief committees back east gathered barrels of clothing for grasshopper sufferers, and proud farming counties, for the first time in their lives, took them. There was no harvest, so there was no money, and so there was a walk. Charles Ingalls put a bundle on his back, left his family on the ruined claim, and went east on foot, something like 200 miles by the family's account, to hire out in the harvest fields the locusts had not reached. He did it again the next year. He was one man in a long grey column of them, walking east down the railroad lines while the wheat country emptied of its men. The novels give the walking a brave shine, and the bravery was real. But this room exists to hold the lamp over the other half of it, because while he walked, for months at a stretch, 2 summers running, Caroline Ingalls was alone on Plum Creek with 3 little girls, one of them hardly more than a baby, in a landscape being eaten to the dirt. Alone with the milking and the hauling and the mending. Alone with whatever money was hidden in the writing desk, making it stretch. Alone with the question that every locust summer asked and would not answer. Whether this family would still be a going concern in the spring. Waiting, in that condition, is not the absence of work. Waiting is work. It is the work of holding a household's nerve while owning none of the decisions, and doing it where the nearest grown voice was a walk away, and the mail came when it came. No diary of Caroline survives to tell us what those months were, so tonight we'll not invent one. But mark the shape of the thing, because you will see it again and again before we're done. The man's ruin sent him out, into roads and crews and company. The woman's ruin sat down in the house with her, and helped with the dishes. By every account the family ever gave, when Charles was home there was music. The fiddle had ridden in the wagon through every one of those moves, wrapped safe, the one possession that was never sold, never traded, never left. On Plum Creek, with the year in ruins outside the door and the eggs of next year's ruin sleeping in the fields, he tuned it up in the evenings and played jigs, hymns, whatever the night needed. Hold that fiddle in your mind. It is the sound of this family refusing, one evening at a time. It is going to matter twice more before we are done. Once in the worst winter of their lives, and once at the very end of everything, in a museum case in Missouri. Under the music, all those years, ran a quieter ledger of losses. Every prairie family kept this ledger. Almost none of them talked about it, and the next room of tonight's house is the one where we open it, gently. Every child on the prairie began the same way, at home, in the bed the family owned, at the mercy of distance. There were no hospitals out there, and for most families no doctor within a half-day's hard driving. When a woman's time came, the best the plains could offer was another woman, a neighbour with strong hands and experience, sent for through the dark, if the weather allowed sending, if the neighbour was near enough to come, so women reckoned their confinements the way sailors reckon a passage. They counted forward to the month and set it against the almanac. A January baby on an open claim meant praying the storms held off, or that the husband could get through. Some families moved the wife to town for the last weeks, when there was a town and money for board. Most could not and did not, and everyone understood the stakes without saying them at the table. When it went well, the neighbour washed the baby, drank a cup of something hot, and drove home. When it went badly beyond helping, hours from any second opinion. The mother's own mother, the person every birthing woman on earth has wanted in the next room since time began, was 1,000 miles east, and learned of it all by letter, the joy or the grief arriving in the same slow mail. If the baby lived, the reckoning simply moved on to the fevers. Summer complaint. The papers called the worst of them, the scourge of infants in the hot months. Diphtheria in the fall. Scarlet fever through a school district like a grass fire. Against all of it, a farm family's whole pharmacy was a shelf. Castor oil, turpentine, whiskey, quinine if they were lucky, and the terrible patience of sitting up. The stones tell the rest, and you can still go read them. Walk any small cemetery out on the old prairie and do the arithmetic on the little markers. Born and died in the same year, born one spring, gone the next, 2, 3, 4 small stones in a single family row, and then close by sometimes the mother's own, dated within days of the smallest one. When death came, the neighbours it had to reach were the same scattered few, and they came. Always, that must be said of them. Women who could not spare an afternoon for visiting would cross the township for a laying out, wash and dress the small body, line the box with what softness the house could spare. Men knocked the coffin together in the barn and said nothing all day. It was the one summons the distance never excused, and everyone answered it knowing their own turn would come. Families did not call this by any special name, and that silence is part of tonight's subject. Losing a child was not rare enough to be astonishing, so grief got no ceremony beyond the burial, no month in bed, no black-bordered year. It was simply the price the country charged, and everyone at every table knew a household that had paid it. The Ingalls family paid it in 1876, and the novels never say so. Not one word in 9 books. Between Plum Creek and everything that came after, Caroline Ingalls had her only son, Charles Frederick Ingalls, called Freddie, born the 1st of November 1875 in the middle of the Grasshopper Ruin. He was never a strong baby. The family said so later, in the careful way families say such things, remembering him as delicate from the start. The summer he was 9 months old, the family was in retreat, the Locust country abandoned, everything sold or packed. The wagon pointed east toward the Iowa hotelier. They stopped along the way at Charles's brother's farm in Minnesota, and there Freddie got worse. A doctor was sent for and came, and it did not matter. He died on the 27th of August, 1876, 9 months and 26 days old. The county's death register spells the family's name wrong. It gives him one line, and the cause in one flat word, the summer word, the one that filled the infant columns of every register on the frontier. And then the record ends because the season did not pause. The family buried their boy and went on to Iowa within days, because the hotel was waiting and the money was gone and the work, as always, would not wait for sorrow. Laura was 9 that summer. In the memoir she wrote at 63, she gave her brother a few plain sentences, and you can feel the plainness holding something down. In the novels written for children, she left him out entirely, as if the family had always been 4 girls and no empty chair. Her biographers, reading the omission, mostly land in the same place. Some rooms you do not reopen, even 60 years on, even for the truth. Caroline said almost nothing, ever, that anyone wrote down. One sentence survives, kept by family memory from her old age, and tonight it can stand for every unrecorded mother in this story. Everything would have been different, she said, if Freddie had lived. No record tells us how she grieved that autumn, or what the road into Iowa was like with an empty lap. We only know the outward facts. There was no stopping. There was a hotel to run within the fortnight, other people's beds to make, other people's suppers to cook. Sorrow got no acreage of its own on the frontier. It boarded in the house with everything else, and it helped with the dishes, and some women carried it that way, silently for 40 years. That is the ledger the little stones keep. Hold it a moment, and then breathe, because the family's next grief did make it into the books, changed, softened, and carrying a secret the novels never told. In the spring of 1879, back in Walnut Grove after the Iowa year, Mary Ingalls got sick. She was 14, the eldest, the careful one, the golden-haired daughter who never tore a dress or spoke out of turn. Every family assigns its children parts, and Mary's part was perfection, and she played it gently. Whatever came for her came hard. The family remembered raging fever, terrible headaches, a face pulled sideways for a time. Neighbours helped nurse. The fever burned for weeks, and when it finally left, it left with her sight. The world went to shadows, and then the shadows went too, and at 14 years old Mary Ingalls was blind entirely for the remaining 49 years of her life. The novels, when they came, would call it scarlet fever, and generations of readers grew up dreading that diagnosis on Mary's behalf. But Laura's own private account, and a letter she wrote late in life, said something vaguer and stranger, some sort of spinal sickness, the doctors helpless, the nerves of the eyes dying past recall. The truth is, the family never really knew what had taken her sight. They knew only the price. In 2013, a team of physicians decided to ask the question properly. They went through everything: Laura's letters and memoir, the school registers, the Walnut Grove newspapers for that spring, the medical literature of the era, and published their finding in the journal Pediatrics. Scarlet fever, they concluded, almost certainly was not the culprit. The pattern fits an inflammation of the brain, most likely viral, what their paper called meningoencephalitis. Even the college Mary later attended had written the era's blunter version in its own register. Cause of blindness, brain fever. Why did the book say scarlet fever? Laura herself gave the answer, with her usual dry honesty. In a letter, readers and publishers knew scarlet fever. It was a story-shaped disease. Already, you notice, the record was being quietly tailored to fit what an audience could recognise. Keep that habit of hers in view. It is the whole final act of tonight. What no diagnosis measures is what that year did to a household of 5 in a little rented house in town. The family rebuilt itself around Mary the way a hand closes around a splinter. Pa's voice became her eyes. He described the land to her: clouds, colours, the road ahead, and the habit stuck for life. And Laura, 12 years old, prickly, competitive, half wild, was formally assigned to be her sister's seeing. Told, in so many words, to be Mary's eyes. She did it. By every account, including her own, she did it without complaint, for years, and the doing of it rewired her. Describing the world aloud to Mary exactly and honestly was the first writing Laura Ingalls ever practiced. The most beloved descriptive voice in American children's literature was trained sentence by sentence at the side of a blind girl. Grief builds strange schools. There was a second tuition being paid in that house, and it was Carolyn's. A blind daughter on the frontier meant a mother's workload rewritten for life. The guiding and guarding and reading aloud and endless describing laid on top of a day already full. No memoir of Caroline survives to complain of it, and knowing everything tonight knows of her, none would have. But mark it in the ledger this night keeps. When historians count what frontier women carried, the caring came stacked on top of the hauling, always, and it had no season. And then the family did the thing that tells you who they were. They pointed their grief at a goal. There was a college for the blind in Vinton, Iowa. A real education, books in raised print, music, handwork, years of it. The territory would carry much of the cost for Dakota students, but not the clothes, not the travel, not the incidentals, and the Ingalls had nothing to spare, so they built the goal into the household like a stove. Every extra dollar, every egg sold, every sewing job, every term anyone could teach, it all pointed at Vinton. It is why they went along when the railroad offered Charles work in Dakota. It is why the family took in a boarder, why Laura sewed shirts in town at 9 years old, by her own account, for pennies a day. And it is why, 4 winters later, a girl of 16 with a days-old certificate said yes, in December, to a school 12 miles out on the open prairie, board included, among strangers named Bouchie. Laura stood in that shanty for Mary. Every week she endured behind that curtain was a week of wages for her sister's education. The knife in the dark was witnessed by a girl who was there as an act of love. They got Mary to Vinton in 1881. She thrived there. 7 years of books and music and friends who did not pity her. And for one long breath in this story, something the family aimed at was simply achieved. Hold that lamp-warm feeling a moment. And while we are resting here at the story's halfway mark, if nights like this one have become part of how you fall asleep, we did make something for exactly these hours. 3 little books of ours live at prairiesecrets.com, and the third, Evenings on the Prairie, ends its stories the way a fiddle ends a long evening, gently. Scan the QR code on your screen, or if you're listening on your phone, the links are waiting in the description and the pinned comments. No hurry at all. They'll keep till morning. Now, pull the quilt back up. We're going back to Smet. because the snow out there is about to start meaning it. The snow that autumn came in the middle of October, which was the first wrong thing. The 15th of October, 1880, a blizzard out of a mild golden afternoon, striking the whole of eastern Dakota with crops half in, hay half stacked, coal sheds half filled. It snowed for 3 days. Cattle died on the open range within a mile of shelter, and men died finding that out. The old hands, what few the new country had, waited for the weather to apologise and give the autumn back. It never did. That October storm was the front door of the winter the plains would measure every other winter against for a century. The one the survivors, needing no adjectives, simply called the hard winter. Modern meteorologists have gone back through that season with the tools of their trade, the army post logs, the railroad records, the signal service reports, and their verdict is the settler's verdict with mathematics attached. It stands among the most severe winters ever documented on the Central Plains. Through January and February, snow fell somewhere in the region on more days than it did not. Towns measured the season in feet, 10 and 11 and 12 of them, and the wind packed those feet into drifts and cuts of rammed ice that stood higher than the locomotives sent against them. The locomotives are the detail that decided everything else, because to Smet, 1 year old, lived by the railroad the way a lamp lives by its oil. Coal came by rail. Kerosene came by rail. Flour came by rail. The town had been built quick and thin on the assumption of trains, and now the company shovelled, and the wind filled the cuts behind the shovellers, and the company shovelled again, and the wind filled it in again. Somewhere in the deep of that winter, the railroad wired its agents and simply stopped until spring. No trains meant the town sat down inside the snow with whatever it happened to have on hand. What the Ingalls family happened to have in the store building where they wintered on the main street was very little. The claims around town emptied inward, families doubling up, and the little settlement began the long business of outlasting. The town pulled inward like a fist. School kept for a while in the bare front room of a store building, until the cold gave out and it stopped keeping at all. Between houses and barns, men strung guide ropes before the big storms, because a person could lose the world completely in the 40 feet between two buildings, and some did. Hold the whole picture a moment. 2 short streets of raw pine boards, huddled on a swell of open grass, the nearest full pantry hundreds of miles east, and the rails filling with packed snow faster than men could empty them. The novels made this winter famous, and its survival mechanics have been told many times. The hay twisted into hard sticks when the coal ran out, the seed wheat ground through a hand coffee mill when the flour did, the brown bread twice a day. Tonight, let the mechanics stand in the corner where they belong, and stay instead inside the part the survivalists cannot hold. Stay with what that winter did to minds. Laura lived it at 13 and 14, and when she wrote it, the details she chose are a clinic in exactly our subject. She wrote the sound first. A plains blizzard was not weather so much as a voice, a scream in the stovepipe that went on for 3 days without drawing breath, so huge and steady that the family gave up talking underneath it and sat, each alone, inside the noise. Then it would stop, and the silence after was somehow worse, a held breath, everyone listening for the wind to gather itself again out on the grass. Storm, stillness, storm, stillness, on a metronome nobody could see, from October to April. She wrote the dark. The kerosene gave out in January, and there was no more at any price. Ma made a lamp out of axle grease in a saucer, a rag twisted around a button for a wick, a little tongue of flame you could cup in 2 hands. That was the light the family ate by and sewed by and looked at each other by through the sunless heart of a Dakota winter. When Laura wrote that scene 50 years later, she remembered the exact colour of that flame. She wrote the repetition: grind, twist, eat, listen. The coffee mill held half a cup of wheat, no more. So somebody was always grinding, hours of every day. The little handle going around under someone's palm until the palm knew nothing else. Twisting hay into sticks tore the skin off knuckles, so the knuckles wrapped in rags and went on twisting. The work was not hard the way harvest is hard. It was small and endless and always the same, and that sameness became its own kind of weather inside the house. And she wrote the numbness, which is the detail that matters most tonight. There is a stretch of her account where the days blur and the family's minds go dull together. Thoughts arriving slow and stupid through the cold, schoolbooks abandoned, conversation run dry, the whole household worn down not to panic, but to something quieter and heavier, a grey. She described her own head refusing to work and hating it. Anyone who has waited out a long dark season in a small space with people they love knows that grey, and knows you do not have to be starving for it to settle in. They were starving slowly, and it settled in anyway. The surest sign of it in that house was the fiddle. You have heard it all night, riding every wagon, answering the locust, the family's standing refusal, in wood and string to be beaten. In the hard winter, the refusal stopped. Pa's hands, split and stiffened from twisting hay in the lean-to, could not finger the strings. Laura wrote the moment with the care people, save for real wounds. He tried. The fiddle would not come right under his ruined fingers, and he put it away in its box, and the house made do with voices, and then, in the worst weeks, with the wind. When the music stops in the house that always had music, you do not need a thermometer. That is the reading. That is how deep the winter got. They came through, all of them, thinner and quieter. In May, the first train finally broke the blockade, and there is one detail from that spring the record keeps like a pressed flower. The Christmas barrel sent by church folk back east, frozen in a boxcar in a snowbound cut all those months, arrived 5 months late, with the Christmas turkey still at the bottom of it. So the family cooked it, opened the windows to the green prairie wind, and had Christmas dinner in May. Hold that picture. A household ground almost to silence for 7 months, deciding unanimously that the feast was not cancelled, only postponed. That instinct, file it away. It is the other half of tonight's story, and it gets its own room before the end. But be fair to the hard winter by admitting what it was, the famous one, the exception that made the newspapers. The ordinary prairie winters made nobody's newspapers, and they were long enough, and this next room belongs to them. An ordinary claim shanty measured perhaps 10 feet by 12, or 12 by 14. Pace that off in your bedroom sometime. It is a few steps and a turn. One room, pine boards and tar paper, a door, a window if the family had stretched to glass, a stove in the middle of everything like a small iron heart. In summer, nobody much noticed the size, because a shanty in summer is a place to sleep between chores that happen outdoors under the biggest ceiling on earth. In winter, the equation flipped. After each storm, a family might be shut in for days while the drifts settled and the cold sat down to stay. Shut in. All ages, all tempers, in one room the size of a modern kitchen for the better part of 5 months. Sod houses, the other great prairie dwelling, traded one hardship for another. Thick earthen walls held warmth far better than boards, and many a soddy family owed the walls their lives. But sod made a dim house, 1 or 2 deep-set windows, floors of packed dirt, ceilings that sifted soil onto the table when the wind worked the roof. Warm, dark, and quiet as a burrow. Some women grew to love their soddies. Others wrote years later that living in the ground did something to their spirits they could never afterward fully describe. People who wrote about those winters kept circling the same strange injury, and it was not frostbite. It was what happened to time. Outdoors, the horizon never changed. Indoors, no bell rang, no cart passed, no neighbour stamped snow at the door. One snowbound day was so exactly like another that the days lost their edges and began to pour together, and people caught themselves not knowing, and then not caring, what day of the week they were living in. Families fought back with ritual, and the fights they chose tell you where the danger lay. They kept the Sabbath with an almanac and a stubborn will, clean shirts and scripture in a house no preacher could reach, because losing hold of Sunday felt like the first plank coming loose. They wound the clock like a sacrament where there was a clock. They kept Saturday baking and Monday washing in their slots, not because the week demanded it, but because the week would dissolve without it. And they read. This is the winter fact that always lands strangest to modern ears. Print was so scarce on the claims that families read everything over and over until they held it by heart, the Bible straight through, last summer's newspapers, the patent medicine almanac, the seed catalogue, read and reread by button lamplight until spring. Some families papered their walls with old newspapers against the drafts, and there are memoirs that describe exactly what you would hope. Children, and not only children, standing at the wall through February reading the room. Mail day was the other clock. Twice a month, weather permitting, somebody rode to town and came back with the post, and the arrival was an event on the scale of weather. Letters were read aloud at the table, then reread alone, then answered slowly, to make the answering last. Eastern papers arrived in bundles weeks old, and were read in strict order anyway. News of a world that had already moved on, savoured like preserves. A woman could tell you years later exactly where she was standing when a particular letter came. The heart out there kept time by the mail. Eugene Smalley, you will notice he keeps standing up in this story. The man could not stop noticing things, saved his bleakest paragraphs for exactly this season. In winter, he wrote, the isolation of the scattered farmhouses became nearly complete. Weeks on end in which a farm family, and above all the farm wife, saw no face that did not sleep under her own roof. The mind, he argued, was simply not built for that, and he had watched sociable, sturdy people come out of their 4th or 5th prairie winter with something worn away that summer did not give back. The winter's real weapon, in the end, was patience. A blizzard could be fought, and the fighting kept people upright. There is very little brooding in anyone's account of the storm days. February was different. February was the same room, the same faces, the same 3 chores, the same white silence at the window, stretching on without a single event to hang a memory on. Thoughts, in that stillness, begin to pace like something kept in a stall. The settlers had a phrase for a neighbour who came out of the cold months changed. They would say quietly that the winter had gotten into them. Nobody out there ever needed that phrase explained. And for the women of this story, the thaw did not exactly bring release. It brought the season of work, and the work, it turns out, had its own kind of silence sewn into it. That is the next room, and it is the one the 800 grandmothers built for us themselves. We're not going to walk a prairie wife's full working day tonight. We have spent other evenings in this series doing exactly that, hour by hour, kettle by kettle. Tonight, look at the day from one particular angle. The angle this whole night has been teaching. Notice who was in the room while the work happened. Start the list anyway, briefly, because the weight matters. Water. Every drop by the bucket from the well or the slough for cooking and washing, and the hens by the barrel on washing day. Fuel carried in, wood where there was wood and where there was not, twisted hay or the dried chips off the buffalo grass, an armload an hour, every hour the stove burned, bread from the sponge up, milking at both ends of the day, the garden, the mending, the churning, the ironing with flat irons off the stove in August heat. Add the arithmetic of clothing a family by hand, of feeding harvest crews, of birthing and nursing and teaching children their letters between all of it. Machines, none, a washboard, a needle, sometimes a sewing machine paid off over years, and the stove. That was the equipment list for keeping 5 or 8 human beings alive on the grass. One corner of the whole enterprise belonged to her outright, and it mattered far past its pennies. The butter and the eggs were, by long custom, the wife's money. She traded them over the store counter for the things the farm books never budgeted: thread, shoes for the children, a paper of pins, postage for the letters east. It was small money, but it was hers, decided by her, the one ledger in the family where her judgment ran the column. Historians of farm women will tell you the egg money was independence in miniature, and the women guarded it accordingly. Now put that day in the empty landscape we've been walking all night and ask the question, who else was there? For the farm wife, on an ordinary day, the answer was nobody. A hired girl was a town luxury. Her mother, her sisters, her cousins were back east, weeks away by letter. The neighbour women, the ones who existed, were their own quarter section away, buried in the identical day. From before dawn until the men came in at dusk, the prairie wife's entire adult society was the kettle, the wind, and children too small to answer back in kind. Her husband's day was no softer, but it was shaped differently, and the difference is the whole point. His work moved. It took him to town for coal and news, to the neighbours to trade work or borrow a bar of iron, into a threshing crew come harvest, whole shouting, sweating, sociable weeks of crews. Farm men complained of many things in their letters. Solitude is rarely one of them. The farm wife's work faced inward, into one room, and repeated. Eugene Smalley saw it plainly and said so in that same famous essay, a century before it was fashionable. The hardest part of the isolation, he wrote, fell on the women. The farmer at least had the stir of the fields, the road, the market town. His wife had the walls, and the same walls tomorrow. The women themselves said it best, and by one strange mercy of history, a great sheaf of what they said survives. In the early 1900s, a Kansas woman named Lilla Day Monroe began collecting the memoirs of the state's surviving pioneer wives, just asked them, hundreds of them, to write down what it had really been like. 800 answered, 800 kitchen table manuscripts, pencil and ink, that sat in files for 2 generations until her great-granddaughter brought them into print. Read in bulk, the memoirs are steadier than you would ever believe. Grasshoppers, fires, fevers, blizzards. The women record them like veterans filing reports. Where the steadiness slips again and again is on one subject only: company, the lack of it, the hunger for it, the distances crossed to get one afternoon of it. One of those Kansas women set down a single image that has outlived all 800 files, and tonight it can speak for the whole shelf. In her young married years, she wrote, left alone on the claim through the working day, the loneliness would sometimes rise past bearing. And when it did, she would walk out to the flock and lie down on the grass among the sheep, just to be near something breathing. Not mad, never mad. She got up again, every time, and put supper on. But hold that picture against every asylum ledger ever ruled, because it is the truer document. The loneliness out there was not vague, not poetic. It was specific, bodily, and it had a sound it missed, another woman's voice in the room. Someone to hold the other end of the quilt, the other end of the day, the other end of a sentence. The work never once paused long enough to go find that voice, and the work, unlike the woman doing it, was never finished. So the question this whole night has been circling finally has to be asked out loud. When it became too much, when the wind and the walls and the waiting closed over someone's head, the way they closed over Olive Bouchie's, what actually happened? Where did those men and women go? For most, the answer is a blank the record never filled. But for some, there is an answer with an address. It sits at the bottom of Dakota Territory, on a rise above the Missouri River, behind a door with a ledger inside. The Territory built the place in 1879, the same year the Ingalls family rolled west to the railroad camp at Smet. The legislature wrote the law, and the governor went looking for a building, and what he found at Yankton was a pair of big wooden structures, originally thrown up to house immigrants passing through. That was the founding of the Dakota Hospital for the Insane. Insane was the legal word, written in the statute, stamped on the commitment papers. The age did not whisper. The beginning was almost laughably small. 5 employees, 31 patients in the first 6 months, brought in by wagon and by rail from across a territory the size of several eastern states put together. 5 of those first 31, the records note, were discharged fully recovered, which tells you the place was at least trying to be a hospital and not only a holding pen. It never emptied again. Year upon year the wards filled, and the territory built brick and built again. And when Dakota split into 2 states, North Dakota raised its own hospital at Jamestown and filled that too. By the 90s, the little rise above the river held hundreds of souls, and the annual reports had settled into the tone of institutions everywhere. Crowded, underfunded, asking the legislature for one more wing. The books are what tonight cares about. Admission registers of that era were ruled like a merchant's daybook, a line to a life. Name, age, sex, nativity, occupation, farmer, labourer, housewife, over and over, housewife. And then the column that stops a modern reader cold, the one headed, in careful copperplate, supposed cause. What filled that column, in asylums across the Plain States, was the era's entire theory of the troubled mind compressed into a dozen tired phrases. Overwork, domestic trouble, ill health, religious excitement, grief, intemperance, childbirth, and, more often than anything, the plainest entry of all, unknown. Read a few lines of such a register slowly, and the sentry opens like a door. A farm wife of 34, nativity Norway, supposed cause, domestic trouble. A labourer of 50, nativity Ohio, supposed cause, overwork. A girl of 19, supposed cause, religious excitement, discharged recovered in the spring. Each line was once a kitchen, a wagon ride, a family standing in a courthouse hallway not looking at one another. The handwriting is beautiful. The handwriting is always beautiful. Here is what those ledgers can honestly tell us, and it is not nothing. They tell us the suffering was real, constant, and arriving out of the farm country in wagons year after year in numbers that kept forcing new construction. They tell us the Plain States' own officials worried in their printed reports about the loads they carried, and about how many of the patients were foreign-born settlers far from kin. The people of that time plainly believed something out there was grinding their neighbours down. They said so in their newspapers, and then they taxed themselves, hard, in poor new states, to put a roof over the result. Belief that pays for brick is belief, and here is what the ledgers cannot tell us, no matter how hard we squint at them, and this is the room where tonight turns honest in a way the legend never does. They cannot tell us whether the prairie actually drove people mad at a higher rate than the crowded eastern cities and old country villages those settlers had left. Nobody was counting the same thing twice. The diagnostic words kept moving. Melancholia in one decade is not melancholia in the next, and none of them map cleanly onto anything we would say now. Worse, the gates of an asylum swung on power as much as on illness. A wife could be committed on a husband's petition and a judge's signature. Historians who work these records will tell you the supposed cause column often says more about the family doing the committing than about the mind being committed. That defiance, grief, change of life, and simple inconvenience all walked in wearing the costume of insanity. A ledger can hold a life. It can also hold a verdict the life never got to appeal. And when modern scholars go looking for the epidemic itself, the great wave of prairie madness the legend promises, the strangest thing happens. It recedes. One respected historian of homesteading, asked about it directly, gave the most honest answer in the whole field. In all his years in the sources, he said, he simply had not come across it. Not as a named thing, not as a wave, not as an epidemic with edges you could draw on a map. So hold both truths at once because both are documented and neither cancels the other. Real anguish beyond any doubt in the testimony, in the newspapers, in the brick at Yankton. and a named epidemic that no ledger anywhere quite delivers. The suffering is certain. The statistics are silence. That gap between the two is not a failure of tonight's story. That gap is the story. Because look what actually lives in the gap. The counting only ever caught the people who crossed a courthouse threshold. It never caught the woman lying among the sheep, who got up and made supper. It never caught the man who stopped speaking from November to March and started again at Thor and was called Moody. It never caught a woman 12 miles south of Smet who stood over her sleeping husband one December night with a butcher knife and a demand to go home, because no doctor ever saw her, no judge ever heard her, and no register ever gave her a line. Maybe we have been asking the prairie the wrong question all along. Not did it drive them mad. The records refuse that question and always will. Ask instead who got counted, who got a ledger line, who got a chapter, who got nothing at all. Laura got the fullest accounting an American life can receive. 60 million books with her name on the spine. Olive Bouchie got one scene in someone else's story under somebody else's name. The 31 souls in the wooden buildings above the river got a line apiece, and a column that mostly said unknown. And out past all of them, uncounted by anything but the wind, stand the ones who simply endured it, which, make no mistake, was the common case, the everyday case, the case this whole night is really about. The prairie's dark history was never a diagnosis. It is a ledger with most of the lines left blank, and for the families out on the grass, watching someone they loved go quiet or go strange, the blankness had a practical shape, a question asked at kitchen tables in a dozen languages. What on earth could actually be done? That room is next, and it is the barest room in the house. Start with the words a family had on hand, because treatment always begins with vocabulary, and theirs was built for weather, not for minds. People out there did not say depression. They said a woman was low, blue, poorly, not herself, which may be the most accurate phrase the whole century produced. They said her nerves were bad, or that she was run down, the way a clock is run down, with the same wishful implication tucked inside the words. A run-down clock only needs somebody to find the key. Nobody said broken. Broken was for ploughs. The kind words did real work, and it is worth pausing to respect them. They let a household admit trouble without shaming it. Let a husband tell a storekeeper his wife was feeling poorly without either man dropping his eyes. But the same softness kept the trouble small enough to ignore. A woman who was only run down needed no doctor, no change, no rescue. She needed spring. And so, season after season, waiting for spring was mostly what happened. The first line of actual treatment was whatever the kitchen could produce. Rest, when rest could be spared, which on a working claim meant almost never. Beef tea and egg flips for the body, on the theory that the mind rode the body like a passenger. A letter written to a far-off mother or sister, and the long weeks waiting on the answer, which arrived full of love and no more able to help than a pressed flower. After the kitchen came the bottle, and the bottle deserves its own honest paragraph. The back pages of every farm paper of that era bloom with patent remedies aimed straight at these households, nerve tonics, blood builders, soothing syrups, celebrated compounds for tired and suffering women, with testimonials from ladies in exactly such counties. Most were alcohol-wearing Sunday clothes. A fair number carried opium or morphine quite legally, with no label required to say so. They work the way a warm bath works, and for about as long, and so in some sod houses and shanties, a respectable, teetotaling, church-going farm wife kept a bottle by the bed for years, and dosed herself through the winters, and nobody in the house ever used a harder word for it than her medicine. The frontier's most common treatment for despair was a spoonful of it, sweetened at bedtime. Past the bottle stood the doctor, and the doctor stood a long way off, in two ways at once. The first way was miles. Fetching him meant a day gone and a team worn, and that was if the weather allowed, and he was not 40 miles the other direction setting a leg. The second way was money, and money was the sharper distance. A doctor's visit cost cash, and cash was the one crop the frontier reliably failed. So family triage ran on a brutal unspoken rule that everyone understood and nobody posted on the wall. A broken leg was a doctor matter. A broken spirit was asked to wait for spring, and then for harvest, and then for the year the wheat came good. And suppose the doctor did come, and was honest, and kind. What then? The medicine of that century, faced with melancholia, had one standing prescription, and the fashionable version of it was written up in all the journals. Rest, change of scene, cheerful society, ease of mind. Read that prescription back in a claim shanty and hear how it lands. Rest, for a woman whose stove went out if she rested. Change of scene, on a homestead the law required her to inhabit. Cheerful society, 12 miles from the nearest woman. It was a medicine cabinet stocked for some other country entirely, for city parlours, for patients with servants. Out on the grass, the cure and the impossibility were the same list. The era did build gentler places than asylums, water cure establishments, rest homes, sanitariums in pine woods, where a worn-down mind could be bathed and fed and walked slowly back to itself. They cost more than a hired man earned in a year. They existed for the class of patient who wrote letters on hotel stationery, and no claim wife within 500 miles of the Bouchie school ever saw the inside of one. When the kitchen failed, and the bottle failed, and spring failed, there was one door left, and every family knew where it led, because we stood inside it a few minutes ago. Commitment was a legal act before it was a medical one. Papers sworn before a county judge. Testimony from a husband, a father, a grown son, a neighbour. A hearing that might last minutes, and then the long ride by wagon and by rail, east or south, to the hospital above the river. Some families made that journey as a last mercy, worn to the bone, out of every option, and some of the people they brought were truly, dangerously ill, and got, at Yankton, at least warmth and food and order. It is not a story with villains in every seat, but some families, the records whisper, moved faster than they should have, and for reasons a modern reader can see straight through the copper plate, and some families would not make the journey at all, at any cost because of what it would mean at church. For those there was the house itself. Rural memoirs speak of it quietly, in half-sentences, a back bedroom kept shut, a sister nobody outside the family had seen in years, an old aunt who was never quite introduced. Shame ran deep enough on the frontier to build its own asylums, one spare room at a time with no ledger at all. But the commonest treatment of all was the one nobody wrote down anywhere, because it looked like nothing happening. The household simply closed around the trouble and carried it. The daughters took over the baking quietly. The husband learned which subjects not to raise. The neighbours, if there were neighbours, noticed the curtains and left a pie and asked nothing. That is what it looks like when a society has no answer. It looks like families absorbing privately at compound interest what no institution would take. Most of the suffering in tonight's story was never treated, never named, and never left home. It was carried by husbands, by children, and above all by the women themselves, at a cost the century never once tried to calculate. And for a very great many households on the plains, every single thing this room has described came with one more lock on the door, because the nearest thing to a cure the country ever offered was talk, a neighbour's kitchen, a preacher's call, a doctor's questions. And talk requires a language the country speaks. It is easy to forget at this distance how foreign the American prairie actually was. This was not a landscape of old Yankee stock spreading west. By the late 1880s, in parts of Dakota, close to half the people had been born across an ocean. Norwegians and Swedes and Danes, Germans from Germany and Germans from Russia, Bohemians, Hollanders, Icelanders. Whole townships lifted out of one valley in the old country and set down, church and all, on the section lines. The men of those families got English the way you get weather by standing out in it. The elevator, the land office, the implement dealer, the threshing crew, a working man's tongue roughened into the new language in a few seasons because his livelihood demanded it. The children got English free at the district school and came home embarrassed by their mothers. The immigrant wife got the claim. Her world was the shanty and the yard, where the old language was the only language, and so the new one never came. Her English, women like her said later, was egg money and good day. Think what that meant, stacked on top of everything else tonight has carried. The distance, the wind, the one room, the waiting, all of it, with the sound turned off. If a Yankee neighbour woman did ride by, the two of them could trade a wave and a loaf, not a sentence. Not one sentence of the talk that keeps a person. Where the old language gathered, it saved. The immigrant congregations planted their services, their hymnals, their ladies' aid societies in the mother tongue, and for thousands of transplanted women, the church basement was the one room in America where they were fully themselves, fluent, funny, competent, known. The pastors understood exactly what they were tending. Some wrote home that they felt less like shepherds than lighthouse keepers. Homesickness in a language nobody around you speaks is a particular illness. The Norwegians, who supplied the plains with so many of its settlers, had a word for it that their doctors sometimes wrote in earnest, a sickness of longing. Their pastors preached against indulging it. Their newspapers, printed in Norwegian in the river towns, carried advertisements for passage home, alongside advertisements for more land, which tells you the argument was never settled in anyone's heart. Nobody wrote that condition down more truthfully than a Norwegian immigrant named Ole Rolvag, who had come over at 20, worked his uncle's Dakota farm, and clawed his way to a professorship, and who then put everything he knew into a novel called Giants in the Earth. It follows a little party of Norwegians out onto the open Dakota grass in the 1870s. The men in the story look at the horizon and see acres, and at the centre stands Bouchie, a devout, tender, homesick wife, transplanted against her deepest grain, who looks at the same horizon and sees the thing tonight has been circling from its first minute. Nothing to hide behind. That is her phrase, and it may be the truest sentence anyone ever wrote about this landscape and the human mind. Not nothing to look at, nothing to hide behind. No tree between a soul and the sky. No wall between a family and the wind. No town between a woman and the size of her own thoughts. As the novel deepens, Bouchie pulls the old immigrant chest, the one that crossed the ocean with her family's name painted on it, into the middle of the sod house, and in the worst hours she shelters inside her own past the only way the prairie allows. Rolvag wrote her with such unbearable accuracy because he was not inventing. He was reporting from the inside of a community that had watched it happen at kitchen tables from Minnesota to the Missouri. Bouchie is fiction, and tonight keeps fiction on its own shelf, clearly labelled. But when the book crossed into English in the late 1920s, it did not land as a Gothic tale. Immigrant families across the plains read her and went quiet because somebody had finally hung the portrait. The book became one of the best-read novels in America, and it planted the figure of the prairie-broken wife so deep in the country's memory that she has never left it since. When people today say prairie madness, the face they are seeing, whether they know it or not, is usually Bouchie's, and within a few years, science came asking the same question in its own dialect. In 1932, a Norwegian psychiatrist named Ornulf Odegaard published a landmark study with a blunt title, Emigration and Insanity. He had done the unglamorous thing. He counted. He followed his emigrated countrymen to Minnesota and set their hospital admissions against the stay-at-home population of Norway, and the emigrants' rates ran markedly higher. Above all, for the gravest illnesses, what it meant, he argued both ways, with a care his era rarely managed. Perhaps the uprooted life, the strain, the strangeness, the lost language and kin pressed minds past their design. Or perhaps the restless and the fragile were simply likelier to emigrate in the first place, carrying their vulnerability up the gangway with them. Selection or strain, the seed or the soil. Psychiatry has been rerunning his question on new populations for nearly a century now, which tells you he found a real one. The honest answer, then and now, appears to be both. What the immigrant record leaves us, in the end, is not a verdict but a chorus, singing in a dozen languages with one recurring note held down under all of them. The letters home stayed cheerful. Land is good. Children thriving. Come and join us. A letter was a performance for worried parents. Postage was dear, and courage was cheaper written than felt. Historians who have read those letters by the thousand will tell you the smile is part of the genre itself. Somewhere behind a fair number of them stood a woman at a plank table in a house made of earth, writing all is well in the old language, with the wind working the roof and nothing on the horizon to hide behind. The record smiles. The record was written for mothers. Remember that whenever the frontier looks happy in its own handwriting, and yet, if tonight stopped here, it would be telling its own kind of lie, and it would be the same lie the Gothic legend tells, just wearing black instead of gingham. Because the plainest fact in all the sources is this: most of them held. Most of the women in this story were not undone, and how they held is not a mystery and not a miracle. It survives in the record as plainly as the ledgers do, and it deserves the warmest room in tonight's house. The people of the plains looked at the same subtraction Eugene Smalley saw, and they set about stubbornly, hammer and thread and hymn book, adding things back. Nowhere to gather? They gathered anyway. The instant a district built its little schoolhouse, the schoolhouse became everything the map had failed to provide: town hall, church, concert stage, courtroom, and social club. A plain boardroom 12 feet wide with lanterns on nails. And within a season or two, almost every district out there had organised the institution with the humblest name and the biggest job in frontier life: the literary. Literary societies, they were formerly debate nights, spelling schools, recitations, mock trials, held through the dead of winter, families driving an hour each way in robes and heated stones for the privilege of a crowded room. The debating was usually terrible. That was never the point. The point was faces, lamplight, laughter, the sound of many voices in one place, the exact medicines the century's doctors kept prescribing, and the land kept out of stock. The young Laura Ingalls attended exactly these into Smet, and wrote about them with a warmth she gave to almost nothing else in town life. For one winter running, by her account, the whole town organised itself around Friday night the way a wheel organises around an axle. Picture the mechanics of one such Friday. Chores done early, supper cold, the whole family bundled into the wagon box on hay, under buffalo robes, flat irons heated on the stove and wrapped in flannel at everyone's feet. An hour across the dark to a schoolhouse already glowing at the window, teams tied in rows outside with blankets over them. Inside, 40 people in a room built for 20, spelling each other down, or arguing with great seriousness whether fire is more destructive than water, and nobody wanting the lamps trimmed for home. Then the hour back, colder, everyone packed together, somebody humming. Ask what the frontier had instead of medicine for loneliness, and this wagon load is the answer. Church came the same way, long before churches did. A circuit preacher in a settler's front room, hymn books from a trunk, communion on a kitchen table, the singing carrying out over the grass to nobody. The Ingalls family helped found the first congregation in De Smet before the town was a year old, and the pattern repeated in 1,000 settlements. The congregation existing years before any building, because the building was never the point either. For the immigrant townships, the church was even more, it was the old country, portable. The Norwegian Lutheran congregation kept the language, the hymns, the confirmations, the whole architecture of a woman's former life, and planted it on the section lines. Historians of the settlement era will tell you flatly that for immigrant women, The congregation was the single strongest rope across everything this night has described. Where the rope reached, women held. Where it did not reach yet, they counted the years until it did. And beneath the formal occasions ran the real network, the daily one woven entirely by women, made of things too small for any archive. A borrowed starter of yeast, walked 2 miles and handed over warm. Quilt patterns traded like currency. Confinements attended, always, everywhere, at any hour in any weather that call was answered. Fevers sat through in shifts. Butter and egg money, the one cash crop a woman controlled, quietly stretched to cover a neighbour's postage or a daughter's shoes. They called it visiting, and neither woman at the table would have dreamed of calling it what it also was. A lifeline maintained on purpose, at real cost in time and horseflesh, against exactly the enemy this night has been naming. When the historian Glenda Riley went through Plains women's diaries and letters in bulk, a career's worth of them, this is what she found on page after page, not a gallery of berets, but a web. Women adapted, she concluded. Painfully, unevenly, at cost, but really and durably, and the web was how. The Ingalls family's own first Dakota winter holds one of the sweetest documented pictures of the whole principle at work. 1879, the family alone at the railroad camp on the empty town site that would become Smet. The nearest household a young couple named Boast, a mile off across the snow. Christmas came. The 2 households pulled together into one warm room and made a holiday out of almost nothing. Games, singing, oyster soup off the supply barrel, jokes remembered for decades. Laura wrote that night, 50 years later, like a lamp seen across snow. 2 families, 1 room, 1 winter, outnumbered. That is the entire technology, and it was enough when it could be had. So let the record show honestly on the legend's own scales. No, the prairie did not empty its people into asylums by the wagon load. Most held. Many flourished and came out the far side with a plain, tested self-respect their eastern sisters were never offered. The diaries ache with loneliness on one page and organise a spelling school on the next. Very few of them surrender, and when the raw settlements aged even a little, the women institutionalised their web with a speed that tells you what it was worth. Ladies' aid societies, sewing circles, cemetery associations, reading clubs, every Plains town's early records fill with them, founded years before the sidewalks. The men's lodges came later and lapsed sooner. The women's held because the women knew, in a way the land pamphlets never printed, exactly what the stakes of gathering were, but hold the counterweight all the way up to the light because it cuts both directions, and this is the hinge of everything tonight. They held because they built. The holding was not a temperament. It was a structure, the literary, the congregation, the visiting web, the boasts across the snow. Which means everything depended on whether the structure had reached you yet, and where it had not reached, where the claim sat too far out, the settlement too new, the family too foreign, the husband's people, not your people. There stood a woman with no literary, no congregation in her language, no visiting kitchen, no boasts a mile off. Tonight you know her name. The women who held were not made of different stuff than Olive Bouchie. They were made of the same stuff, standing nearer the fire, which brings tonight at last back around to the girl behind the curtain, grown old now, on a hilltop in Missouri, with a pencil in her hand and a decision to make about the truth. By 1930 she was 63 years old, settled at Rocky Ridge Farm outside Mansfield, Missouri, in hill country, with trees on every horizon, about as far from open prairie as the continent could offer her. The moving was long over. Pa was gone, Ma was gone, Mary was gone. Whatever had chased the Ingalls family across 4 decades and 5 states had finally lost the scent. And that was the year Laura Ingalls Wilder bought a stack of cheap school tablets the kind with orange covers, sharpened a pencil, and wrote down her whole life, plainly, from the beginning, in her own hand. She called it Pioneer Girl, and it was not a children's book. It had Freddie in it. It had Burr Oak and the saloon next door, the drinking she'd watched through a hotel window, the debts, the going without, the relief barrels. It had a 16-year-old boarder behind a curtain, and a silent woman named Bouchie, and a butcher knife catching the light. It was the record, set down at last by the one witness who had carried all of it in her head for half a century, and nobody wanted it. Her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, was by then one of the highest-paid magazine writers in America, with agents and editors and famous friends, and she put the manuscript through her whole machine. She typed it, shaped it, retitled it, sent it out. New York said no, and no, and no again. A plain, dark, truthful memoir of frontier hardship, offered to a country sliding into the Depression, was nobody's idea of a seller. America was losing its farms that year. It did not want to read that it had always been losing them, so the two women did something with the record that will be argued about as long as the books are read. They turned it, cut it down to childhood, warmed the light, and offered the first slice as a children's book. It became Little House in the Big Woods, and it landed in 1932 like rain on burnt grass. The country, it turned out, was starving for exactly this, a family that faced the dark and always came through. The books followed one after another for a decade, and they have never in 90 years been out of print. Rose's part in the turning was real, and the surviving manuscripts prove it. She edited hard, argued structure, carried the pages to the publishers her mother had never met. She did all of this, her own diaries show, while fighting years-long sieges of black despair that she hid from nearly everyone, writing courage for a living while privately rationing her own. Whatever else the Little House books are, they are the work of two frontier daughters, one writing, one editing, both of whom knew from the inside precisely how heavy the true material was, and decided together, page by page, how much weight a child's hand should carry. The two of them argued about it, on paper, and some of the letters survive. Laura pushed for the facts as she had lived them. Rose pushed for the story a reader could follow, and each edited the other with the particular mercilessness of family. What children could bear was a live question between them, negotiated scene by scene. It is worth knowing that the gentlest books in American childhood were hammered out that way, two tough-minded frontier daughters bargaining over the dark. Not much was the decision. The little brother stayed buried. The Iowa year vanished whole, saloon and all. The debts became adventures. The relief barrels became Christmas barrels, and the government aid the family had accepted was quietly written out of the family story. 16 sounded less astonishing than 15, so the teaching certificate came at 15, and a struggling family named Bouchie was issued a storybook name, Brewster, to carry its trouble under forever. Book by book the darkness was rendered down, and the myth rose like cream. The fiddle, the firelight, the wolves kept always outside the door. It was not a lie exactly. Every scene had truly happened, or nearly. It was a sieve, and what stayed in the sieve was gold, and what washed through was everything tonight has spent 2 hours recovering. And America took the sieve for the river. That is the part nobody planned. The books were written as stories and read as history, and within a generation the sunlit version had become the country's official memory of its own settlement, taught in classrooms, filmed for television, quoted in speeches praising pioneer stock. The failure rates, the relief barrels, the asylum wagons, the olives. All of it slid quietly out of the national photograph the way Freddie slid out of the family one. Tonight is not an accusation about that. It is only the other half of the album, which is what makes the exception so very loud. In 1943, in the 8th book, the last published in her lifetime, readers turned a page and found a chapter titled, in her own words, A Knife in the Dark. the shanty, the screaming in the black cold, Mrs. Brewster standing over her sleeping husband with the butcher knife, demanding to go back east. The girl behind the curtain, lying rigid till dawn. It is the one scene in all those thousands of pages where the true cost of the prairie, the cost this whole night has been walking through, the isolation and the wind and the trapped and breaking wife, stands up straight in a children's book and shows itself with the lamp held high. Her editor, by the accounts that survive, thought it too frightening for young readers and suggested it come out. The woman who had cut her own dead brother from the record, who had cut an entire state, an entire year, every debt and every relief barrel, looked at the darkest page she had and said no, it stays. She never explained the choice. Writers rarely explain their one exception. But 6 years earlier, at a book fair in Detroit, standing in a department store at 70 years old, she had come as close as she ever came, in one sentence that deserves to be heard in full. "All I have told is true," she said, "but it is not the whole truth. There were things," she went on, "that she had known as a child which she would not put in a book for children." Turn her sentence over once and it stops being an apology and becomes an inventory. It means she knew precisely what she was leaving out. All of it. Every grave and ledger line and shut-back bedroom this night has visited. The softening of the frontier was not innocence. It was a working writer's decision, made with clear eyes, about what the country wanted from its own memory, and what children could bear to carry of it. And measured against that sentence, the knife chapter reads like the one clause she refused to sign. Cut that scene, and Olive Bouchie vanished from the earth entirely, her one witness silenced, her one night smoothed over, the last trace of her gone the way of Freddie and Burr Oak. Keep it, and somewhere inside the most beloved and comforting children's series in American history, there would always be one shanty with the cold coming through the wall, one woman at the end of her strength seen, one reader, years later, grown now, lying awake and wondering what had really happened out there, and to how many. She kept it. You are the reader she kept it for. Tonight was the wondering, and now there is nothing left but to close the accounts, to find out what became of them all after. The Bouchie settlement's trouble did not end with that winter. 3 years after Laura's term, in 1887, a death in that family put a manslaughter case on the docket of the Kingsbury County Courthouse, and among the defendants stood the mother of some of Laura's own pupils, kin to Olive by marriage. The historians who found the file described the depositions as the portrait of a strained and unhappy household, and tonight we'll leave the particulars in the vault where they found them. Restraint is owed to the dead, and nothing in that file would change what this night has already understood. Of Olive herself, after that winter, the record gives almost nothing. No interview, no memoir, no photograph anyone has matched to her with certainty, and no line in any hospital ledger that scholarship has tied to her name. She lived a documented life for exactly one night, through a crack in a curtain in the memory of a frightened girl. Whatever piece she found or never found, no page holds it. That blank, after everything tonight has counted, is the truest artifact the whole story owns. One small mercy is worth adding, and it belongs to this century. Because Laura kept the scene, researchers went looking, and because they went looking, Olive Bouchie has now been found, her real name restored in the annotated editions, her census lines gathered, her existence pinned back onto the record she had slipped out of. It took more than a century, and a knife kept glinting in a children's book, but the counting, in the end, reached her. Laura finished the Bouchie term in the cold of February 1884, took her wages home for Mary's sake, and never boarded in that settlement again. She taught twice more, near a town, on friendlier hearths, and in August of 1885 she married the young man with the good horses, quietly, in a minister's parlour, in a made-over black dress. The prairie was not finished collecting from her either, And honesty gets one paragraph here. In the first 4 years of that marriage came diphtheria for them both, a baby son who lived 12 days and has no name on his stone. The house Almanzo built her burned to the ground, and drought on drought. In 1894 they left Dakota for good, a wagon and $100 bill hidden in a writing desk, bound for the Missouri hills. She was 27 and had already buried more than most long lives ask. The book stopped before all of this, and perhaps now you understand every reason why. On the hilltop at Rocky Ridge came the apple trees, the hen money, the farm paper columns, and at 63 the orange tablets, and at 65 the fame, and after that the whole unlikely last act. She outlived them all: Pa, Ma, Mary, Carrie, Grace, Almanzo, and every publisher who had said no. She died at Rocky Ridge in February of 1957, 3 days past her 90th birthday, the best-known farm woman on the face of the earth, with a butcher knife still glinting in Chapter 7 of her happiest book, exactly where she had insisted it stay. Mary finished the long course at Vinton, skilled in music and fine handwork, and came home to Ma into Smet and lived a small, useful, uncomplaining town life. Fly nets and needlework for the neighbours, the parlour organ the family had scraped and saved to buy her, hymns in the evening with the windows open. She outlived Ma by 4 years and died in 1928. If her life reads quiet, remember what tonight knows. It was the life that years of scraped-together dollars and one knife-watched winter of her sister's teaching wages had been spent, gladly, to buy. Pa went first and easiest in 1902, in his own bed into Smet with his family around him, the town's beloved fixture, trustee, deacon, street commissioner, the man who had fiddled a starving town through the hard winter. And the fiddle passed to Laura, who could no more have parted with it than with her own hands. It exists tonight. It rests in the museum at Mansfield with her things, the actual instrument, the one that rode every wagon in this story, that answered the locusts, that fell silent in the hard winter when Pa's hands gave out, that played the sun down on every claim the family ever tried. String slack now under glass, and by common agreement of everyone who visits, the most eloquent object the whole story left behind. Every mile of tonight is stored in that box. The places themselves have become shrines, if you ever care to go. De Smet keeps the surveyor's house where the family spent that first railroad winter, and the home Pa built in town. And every summer the town raises a pageant out on the old homestead land, children playing the Ingallses in the long grass at dusk. Down at Mansfield, the farmhouse at Rocky Ridge stands exactly as she left it, her desk by the window. Pilgrims come by the tens of thousands, most of them women, many with a daughter alongside. Whatever the books did and did not tell, something in them has kept its grip on 3 generations, and counting. And the country itself, the wide antagonist of this whole night, the Rocky Mountain locust, destroyer of Plum Creek, is gone from the earth, extinct entirely. The last living specimen collected in 1902, the same year Pa died. No human eye has seen one since. The homestead boom crested and broke on the dry years, and across great stretches of the plains the people have been thinning back out for a century, quarter section by quarter section, the grass patiently taking its country back. Out south of De Smet, the Bouchie school country is still 12 miles from town. The town is still small, and on a winter night, the wind out there still sounds exactly the way a 16-year-old behind a curtain heard it. The same 3 notes, the same loose corner, the same enormous dark. Only now you know who was listening inside it. So come back in, one last time, and let's bank the fire. The shanty again. But gently now, the way memory keeps a place once the fear has been aired out of it. The curtain hangs still on its wire. The stove ticks as it cools, that small patient sound iron makes when the day is over. The quilt is heavy in the good way, wait without worry, and the straw underneath has gone quiet. The lamp is turned low, and this time it stays lit. A steady thumb's width of gold on the table, enough to find the room by, enough to be found by. The coffee mill sits on its shelf with its little drawer shut, all its grinding done. Somewhere across 12 dark miles a fiddle is being laid back in its case after one last slow air, and the latches click, soft as 2 snowflakes landing. Even the wind has dropped to its lowest register. Less a voice now than a long breath moving over the grass, the sound of a whole country rolling over in its sleep. Snow is coming, but the easy kind, the kind that only tucks things in. Nothing out there is coming for this house. Nothing out there is coming for yours. Hold all of them in that kindly light for one moment more. The girl behind the curtain, who kept her word to the truth, the woman by the bed, whom you will never again mistake for a villain, the mother at the coffee mill, the mothers by the small stones, the ones lying down among the sheep, the ones in the wide grass who got no line in any book until tonight. They asked for so little. Company, a road with someone on it, a voice at the door. For a couple of hours they have had yours, which is a kind of visiting and long overdue. And now look how rich you are without moving a muscle. There is warmth in your walls that no one hauled in armloads. There is light a finger touch away, and water singing in pipes, and past your window, town or field, it makes no difference. There are people, near enough to reach by morning, near enough to call by name. The distance that wore those women down has no purchase on you at all tonight. You are, by every measure this story keeps, among the most accompanied human beings who ever lived. Let that be the last thing you know before sleep. Not the knife, the nearness. The term is over. The wages are earned. The sleigh has come jingling for you too, and somebody steady is driving, and 12 miles home goes by in no time at all when it isn't you holding the reins, so let them go. Let the snow do its slow, kind work over the whole wide country, over De Smet and Plum Creek and Vinton and the hilltop in Missouri, over every quarter section and every small stone, and rest. Thanks for spending the night out here with me on the old prairie. Sleep somewhere warm inside it. Good night.